Dad, I'm live streaming to show everyone how much I care about you, my son roared, the phone inches from my pale face. Nurses gasped, patients whispered, and the shame was hotter than my illness. It wasn't there to comfort me, it was there to humiliate me. And right there, under the flickering hospital lights, I swore I wouldn't cry. The next day, before we get into why this is, if you believe karma always finds a way, subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Dad, I'm live streaming to show everyone how much I care about you, my son roared, the phone inches from my pale face. Nurses gasped. Patients whispered. The shame was hotter than my illness. He wasn't there to comfort me, he was there to humiliate me. The next day, the lights still flickered, the machines still beeped, but something inside me had gone very still. Pain has a temperature. Mine cooled into resolve. I stared at the ceiling and counted breaths slow, deliberate like I used to count pennies when bills were due. I had once believed that love was simple. You give, a child grows, and one day he gives back. I was wrong. I gave. And still, and he wanted more. I remember the first time he called me old man with a laugh. I pretended not to hear it. I told myself it was just teasing, just a son trying on a swagger that would fall off with age. But swagger hardens when it is fed. I fed it with tuition, with a car, with a wedding that was more pageant than promise. I sold my only vacation apartment so he wouldn't drown under the debts he poured himself like drinks. When his mother left last year, said I was married to responsibility more than to her, I held the door and the silence both. I did not chase her. I did not drink. I went back to work past retirement age so Jason could open a shop. He called it his dream. I called it my duty. And then the hospital. My chest felt like a locked door with no key. The nurse asked if I wanted to rest. I said yes. Rest is not sleep, it is permission to remember. I remembered the way Jason angled the phone so my tubes were visible. I remembered the smirk, half pity, half performance. He spoke to the camera, not to me. My father is a fighter, he announced, and I could hear the clink of incoming comments in his head, like coins tallying in a jar that was never mine. I did not cry. Tears would have given him a better shot, a sharper story. I swallowed them and tasted metal. The world now runs on batteries and bandwidth. Mercy, it seems, runs on views. A chaplain stopped by. He stood in the doorway, unsure whether to cross into a room that felt crowded with ghosts, my former strength, my former pride, the version of my son that used to hold my hand across the street. He said a quiet blessing. I nodded. Blessings are fine, paperwork is better. So I called a lawyer. My voice shook, but the words were steady. I asked for the documents I had once drafted, and then buried in a drawer labeled Later. Later had arrived rude, bright, and public. I thought of Jason's followers, the strangers who typed hearts while my heart stuttered. I thought of the neighbors who would watch the clip and say, "What a good son." And I thought, if he wants an audience, he can have one. But the stage will not be mine. He took my dignity for content. I will take back my name for record. Not revenge. Not yet. Accountancy. Line by line. Clause by clause. Witness by witness. And when the total is added, when the ledger closes, there will be no balance due from me. When Jason was little, I believed in miracles disguised as routines, packing his lunchbox, tying his shoelaces, sitting up late while he coughed through fevers. His mother used to say, "You love him too much, Marcos. You'll spoil him." I said nothing, because I thought there was no such thing as too much love for a son. When she left last year, her words returned like prophecy. Maybe she had seen the rot I refused to see. Jason grew into a man who thought giving was my permanent job, and taking was his natural right. I paid for his college degree in business, though my own education ended after high school. I took double shifts at the bank, and when my hands shook from age and exhaustion, I told myself it was worth it. He was supposed to climb where I never could. He climbed, yes, but not on his own strength. He climbed my back. When he graduated, I thought the burden might ease. But graduations are expensive. He wanted a car to match his diploma. I co-signed the loan. He wanted an apartment close to downtown. I dipped into savings. He wanted a honeymoon across the ocean. I maxed out a credit line. Each time he said, "You're the best, Dad." Each time I swallowed the pride like medicine that would one day heal me. Instead, it hollowed me. He married a woman who looked at me like a burden she hadn't agreed to. At the wedding, she smiled for photos and whispered complaints about the menu. I smiled back, paid the caterer, and told myself maybe children change after they become parents. But Jason never changed. He just grew sharper, louder, more certain that I existed to fund his dreams. Debt followed him like smoke, and I, the old fool, followed with buckets of water. I covered late bills, erased interest, quieted creditors. I told myself, better me than strangers. At least this way he still needed me. But need without respect is not love, it is leeching. The day came when I sold my only vacation apartment, a small place by the coast, where I once planned to retire with a fishing pole and silence. I signed it away so Jason wouldn't drown under his credit card balances. He promised, "I'll pay you back one day." That day never came. Instead, he posted selfies from clubs, hashtags about grinding and success, while my grind was overtime hours at an age when most men are dead or golfing. I told myself patience is love, but love without limits turns into permission. And Jason learned, well, if he asked, I would give. If he demanded, I would bend. I thought sacrifice made me a father. But in truth, it only made me fuel. Until the hospital, until the live stream, until the shame that burned hotter than fevers and debts combined. That was the first moment I whispered to myself, not out loud, never out loud, enough. Jason's wedding should have been the proudest day of my life. Instead, it was another receipt stapled to my heart. Every bill wore my name, the venue, the band, the photographs. I told myself, it's tradition. A father gives his son a start. But the truth was simpler, Jason demanded, and I delivered. I remember standing in a rented tuxedo that pinched at the shoulders, watching my son dance under chandeliers I had paid for. His wife's gown shimmered, her smile gleamed for the camera, but when her eyes slid to me, they cooled like glass. I was not her father-in-law, I was the financier. Later that night, when guests toasted the new couple, Jason raised his glass and said, "Here's to Dad, who makes it all possible." Laughter followed, applause followed. But I felt stripped bare, not honored, exposed. They weren't cheering me. They were clapping for the wallet I had become. After the honeymoon, another expense I swallowed, Jason came to me with his next dream, a shop, his and his wife's chance to be entrepreneurs. I knew better, but I nodded anyway. I told myself this would be the final sacrifice. I would retire and let them run their lives. But the final sacrifice always hides behind the next one. I went back to work past retirement age. My hands ached, my back stiffened, but I kept clocking in. The bank had no reason to keep me, but I begged for hours. Pride tastes bitter, but it still keeps the lights on, and those lights kept Jason's shop open. He called me old-fashioned, laughed at my spreadsheets, told me I didn't understand modern markets. Maybe he was right. What I did understand was labor, repetition, discipline, the things he had never truly learned. He had hashtags. I had overtime. Months passed. His wife bought new dresses. He upgraded his phone. I, meanwhile, traded dinners for instant noodles and painkillers for my knees. But I told myself, this is what fathers do. We hold the line so our children can advance. We give so they can live better. But the more I gave, the less he saw me. My existence shrank to invoices and deposits. He no longer asked how I was. He didn't care if I ate or if I slept. I was a ledger that never closed. Until the illness came, the hospital bed, the tubes in my chest. And even then, Jason didn't come for me. He came for the camera. The fallout of that live stream spread faster than fever. Neighbors knocked on my door after discharge, smiling with pity, saying, "Your boy's such a good son." They didn't see the tubes. They didn't feel the shame. They saw a polished clip online, Jason holding my hand, talking about sacrifice, while emojis poured across the screen. They called him devoted. They called me blessed. I wanted to shout, to tell them it was theater. But who believes an old man coughing through sentences when a young man beams into cameras with perfect lighting? Image wins over truth, always. And Jason knew it. He doubled down online. Posted photos of himself by my hospital bed with captions about family, loyalty, love. Strangers commented, "What an inspiration." They shared his posts, praised his dedication. He basked in it. He didn't once ask if I'd eaten that day, or if I needed help paying for medicine. His care ended when the camera lens closed. The whispers reached even my old colleagues. Some wrote letters, congratulating me for raising such a son. I folded the letters, tucked them in a drawer, and felt my lungs tighten not from illness, but from humiliation. I had built my life on numbers that balanced. Yet here, the math of truth and lies didn't add up. Worse, Jason began to treat my suffering like his brand. He scheduled visits around peak online hours. He filmed me while I slept. He posted videos of himself praying at my bedside, though the only prayer I heard was the buzz of notifications. He didn't bring water or blankets. He brought batteries for his phone. I felt invisible in my own story, reduced to a backdrop for Jason's performance. He was the hero, I was the prop, and the world applauded. It was then, lying awake at 3 a.m, that the seed took root. Not rage, no. Rage burns too fast. Something colder, firmer. I thought of the word my profession had trained me to respect above all: accountability. He wanted the world to see me as weak. I would let them see him as he was. He thought humiliation was free. I would show him its price. In the quiet hours after the nurses dimmed the lights, I wrestled with a question heavier than any debt. Should a father ever dream of revenge against his own son? The word itself felt poisonous, unfit for bloodlines. I told myself I was just angry, just tired, just sick. But beneath all those excuses lived a sharper truth Jason had crossed from son to stranger. Memories betrayed me. I saw him as a boy, hair sticking up in the mornings, asking me to tie his shoes. I saw him running with scraped knees, crying for me. Those images fought with the man holding a phone to my face, grinning for strangers. My heart split down the middle, half father, half victim. I tried to forgive in advance, to smother the fire before it grew. But forgiveness without repentance is surrender. And surrender, I realized, would leave me buried with debts unpaid, not financial ones, but debts of dignity. Jason had taken too much already. He would not take the last of me. For days, I tested the thought in secret, like pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurts. Could I hold him accountable? Could I draw a line? Could I become the one person in his life who refused to applaud the performance? The answer came slowly, but it came. Yes, I could. I must. This was not about cruelty, not about punishment. It was about balance, the same balance I had chased for 40 years in ledgers and accounts. A life out of order cannot stand. A son who feeds on his father's blood cannot call it love. So I whispered the word enough again, firmer this time. Not in anger, not in grief, in decision. If Jason insisted on treating me like a stage, then I would teach him what happens when the curtain falls. If he insisted on turning my suffering into spectacle, I would show him the cost of spotlight. Not with fists, not with shouting, but with papers, clauses, signatures, the quiet weapons that cut deeper than steel. I turned my face to the window, watched dawn push shadows across the floor, and felt a strange calm. For the first time in years, I was not waiting for Jason to change. I was preparing for myself to. When the nurses adjusted my IV line and the room quieted, memory filled the silence. It dragged me back decades, to a younger version of myself, standing in line at the bank I worked for, filling out overtime slips so my boy could stay in school. Jason was barely 18 then, sharp-eyed, restless, always wanting more. College wasn't cheap, but I told myself it was a ticket to his future, a future better than my own. I remember coming home past midnight, my tie loosened, my bones aching. He'd be on the couch with friends, laughing at shows, pizza boxes stacked high. I never asked him to get a job, I told myself. Let him focus on his studies. That's what a good father does. But beneath the pride was exhaustion. My body sagged, my hair grayed early, yet I kept showing up. For him, when tuition bills landed, I didn't flinch. I took extra shifts, skipped vacations, ignored the chest tightness that whispered warnings I refused to hear. I convinced myself every sacrifice was an investment, that one day he would say, "Dad, I see what you did for me. Let me carry you now." But Jason didn't see sacrifice. He saw supply. I bought him his first car so he wouldn't struggle commuting. He called it freedom. I called it responsibility. But soon he was out late, flashing it to friends, treating it not as a lifeline, but as proof he was already ahead. I remember the first time he mocked me. "You wouldn't understand, Dad, you never went to college." He laughed, careless, and his friends laughed too. I smiled, swallowed the sting, and told myself it was youth speaking, not the man he would become. But disrespect has a way of repeating until it becomes rhythm, and I, foolishly, kept the beat by staying silent. Looking back, I realized those years weren't just about tuition or cars or debts. They were the blueprint. Each sacrifice laid a brick in the house of entitlement Jason built for himself. And I, thinking I was a craftsman of love, was only his laborer. The hospital walls hummed, pulling me back to the present. But the memories stayed. They weren't lessons back then. Now they were evidence. Evidence of how long I had carried him. Evidence of how long he had let me. It wasn't long after Jason graduated that the calls began. Not calls to check on me, but calls for rescue. He had maxed out credit cards, bought things he couldn't afford, designer clothes, nights out, gadgets I couldn't even name. His voice on the line carried no shame, only urgency. "Dad, I just need a little help. You understand, right?" I always understood. That was the problem. I drained savings to cover his debts. I worked weekends at the branch, even when my joints protested, even when younger managers hinted I should slow down. Jason told me I was old-fashioned, that I didn't get how credit worked. Maybe I didn't. What I did know was responsibility. If you owe, you pay. If you spend, you earn. I thought he'd learn by watching me. Instead, he learned how easily I would bend. I remember once handing him a check and saying, "This is the last time, Jason. You need to manage better." He hugged me, thanked me, promised change. A week later, he posted photos online from a club, smiling wide, champagne in hand. The caption read, "Work hard, play harder." The likes poured in. My heart sank. I showed the post to a colleague at work, hoping for advice. He shrugged and said, "Kids these days." But Jason wasn't a kid anymore. He was a man choosing comfort over character, and I was funding the choice. The worst part? He didn't even hide it. He flaunted it, confident I would cover the fallout. And I did, over and over. Every payment chipped away at me, at my health, my pride, my belief that family meant reciprocity. Sacrifice became routine. My bank statements read like a diary of disappointment. Deposits out, withdrawals in, all under the name of love. But what kind of love demands endless ransom? What kind of son mistakes survival money for pocket change? Each bailout was supposed to buy me peace. Instead, it bought me silence, his silence. Fewer visits, fewer calls. Unless another bill was due. Looking back, those debts weren't just financial. They were the interest on every time I refused to say no. When Jason came to me about the shop, his voice was honey. "Dad, this is the big one. Just a small investment, and I'll finally stand on my own." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe the years of bailouts had been stepping stones, not sinkholes. So I nodded. Again. He and his wife called it their dream. I called it my retirement, sacrificed piece by piece. I should have been slowing down, traveling, fishing by the coast where my apartment once stood. Instead, I was back in a suit, clocking hours I didn't have, funding shelves of inventory and rent for a shop I barely understood. Jason mocked my spreadsheets when I asked for updates. "Dad, you're too old school. Business today is about vision, not numbers." But numbers had carried me through life. Numbers kept roofs overhead and lights burning. Vision without numbers is fantasy. I knew it, but he didn't care. The shop became a stage, just like everything else. Jason posted photos of grand openings, of ribbon cuttings, of his wife smiling beside products stacked high. Online, he looked like a success story. Offline, bills piled, rent lagged, suppliers called late at night. And every time, he turned to me, I dipped into pension funds. I worked past retirement, my back screaming, my knees stiff. Colleagues gave me puzzled looks. Why was I still grinding at 70? I smiled and said, "Family comes first." But in truth, family was bleeding me dry. Jason didn't hide his disdain for my concern. At dinner once, I asked him how sales were going. He smirked, waved me off, and said, "You wouldn't get it, Dad. It's a new world now." His wife laughed, rolling her eyes. I stabbed at my food and chewed bitterness. What he didn't see, what he never cared to see, was how much of my life I was spending to keep his dream alive. Each dollar was a piece of my strength, a year shaved from what little future I had left. He had turned me from father into investor, and worst of all, into fool. I told myself maybe this was the last time. Maybe this shop would finally free us both. But deep down, I knew the truth. Nothing would ever be enough for Jason. And still, I kept paying. Dinners with Jason grew shorter, colder. He'd sit across from me, scrolling through his phone between bites, barely listening. I'd ask about his life, his work, his wife. He'd nod, distracted, then changed the subject back to money, to investments, to what he needed next. His wife barely hid her contempt. When I told a story from my youth about how I once walked miles to the bank job that fed us, she sighed, rolled her eyes, and excused herself to the bathroom. Jason chuckled and said, "Dad, don't bore her with old man stories." Old man stories. That's what my sacrifices had become. Still, I endured. I paid for the meals, left tips large enough to cover his pride. I told myself, this is family, this is what fathers do. But each dinner left me emptier. I drove home to a dark house, silence pressing against the walls. I replayed conversations, searching for a spark of gratitude, some flicker of the boy who once hugged me without asking for anything. I never found him. Jason had become fluent in disrespect. Every laugh at my expense, every dismissal of my advice, every request for money disguised as opportunity, it all stacked, brick upon brick, until I could no longer see daylight. I remember one night in particular. We sat in a trendy restaurant he insisted on. I tried to warn him about overspending, about the danger of debt. He leaned back, grinning, and said, "Relax, Dad. You worry too much. That's why you never had anything big. Times have changed. I'm not going to live like you, scared small." The words lodged in my chest like splinters. Small, scared. That was his picture of me, the man who gave him everything. He didn't see the sacrifices as strength. He saw them as weakness. He mistook humility for failure. I smiled through it, because what else could I do? But on the drive home, my hands trembled on the wheel. I told myself I'd swallow it again, like I always did. But the bitterness stayed. It didn't dissolve. It calcified. I had become invisible to my own son, except for the money in my pocket, and I knew deep down he wasn't done taking. Not yet. And, I wasn't done giving. Not yet. When my wife left, she didn't slam the door. She simply carried her suitcase down the hall, eyes dry, voice steady. "You're married to responsibility more than to me," she said. I didn't stop her. I just stood there, stunned, while the echo of her footsteps dissolved into silence. Years of sacrifice for Jason had drained me of more than money. They had drained me of a husband's attention, of companionship, of love. The house became a hollow shell after that. Empty chairs at the table, a bed too wide. Nights stretched long, filled only with the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of my joints. I thought Jason might notice. I thought he might call, invite me to dinner, sit with me in the void his mother left behind. He didn't. He knew she was gone. He knew I was alone. Still, no phone calls came except the ones tied to his needs. "Dad, can you cover this month's rent? Dad, I need a little help with the shop." He didn't ask how I was eating. He didn't ask how I was sleeping. He didn't even ask how my heart was holding up after decades of carrying us both. I gave him everything, and in return, he gave me absence. The neighbors noticed before he did. They asked where my wife had gone, if Jason was helping me. I lied, smiled, told them I was fine. Pride is a mask we wear until it fuses to our skin. I wore it every day. Loneliness is a weight you don't feel at once. It drips onto you, drop by drop, until suddenly you can't breathe under it. I carried that weight into every corner of the house, into every shift at the bank, into every night when I sat staring at the clock, waiting for a call that never came. And then the illness arrived, creeping in like an intruder who found the door already unlocked. My body buckled under the years I had spent feeding others instead of myself. Doctors' visits multiplied, pills lined the counter. Still, I told no one. Not Jason. Not even the neighbors, I thought. Maybe when he sees me weak, he'll come. He did come, eventually, with a phone in his hand. The illness crept in quietly, like rust spreading through iron. At first it was just breathlessness after climbing the stairs, then dizzy spells that sent me gripping for walls. I told myself it was age, just age. But deep down, I knew something heavier was moving in. Doctor visits confirmed it. My heart was failing me. Years of long shifts, skipped meals, sleepless nights, they had carved their toll into my chest. "You need rest," the doctor said. Rest. The word sounded like a luxury I could never afford. I didn't tell Jason. I couldn't. Not because I wanted to protect him, but because I knew what would follow performance, dramatics, pity disguised as pride. I didn't want my illness turned into his show. So I kept it quiet. I filled pill boxes, charted dosages, and carried the burden alone. The nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed, the ceiling fan turning above, and listen to the uneven drum of my own heart. I thought of the years I had spent pouring strength into Jason, how much of myself I had given away, and wondered if there was enough left to fight for me. The loneliness grew heavier. My wife was gone. My friends were distant, retired, moved on. The house echoed with absence. I would sit at the kitchen table, bills spread out before me, and feel the weight pressing harder than any number on paper. Still, I said nothing. Not even when the fatigue made walking to the mailbox feel like climbing a hill. Not even when the shortness of breath left me gripping the counter for balance. I endured because enduring had become my habit. Until one day I couldn't. Until I collapsed, breath stolen, body trembling. The neighbors called an ambulance. I woke up in a hospital bed, tubes snaking from my arms, monitors chirping like impatient birds. And still, I thought of Jason. I thought, will he come? Will he notice now? Will he see me, not as a source, not as a stage, but as his father? He did come, but not for me. He came for the camera. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and final chances. I lay there, counting the slow beats of my fragile heart, when the door opened. For a moment, I thought it might be Jason the son, not the showman, the boy I once carried on my shoulders, running through parks, laughing under summer skies. But no, the man who entered was already holding his phone, face angled toward the light. He grinned at the camera before he looked at me. "My father's a fighter," he announced, loud enough for strangers in the hall to hear. He positioned the lens to capture the tubes, the machines, my weakness. Gasps followed from nearby beds. Whispers spread like fire. I wasn't his father anymore. I was his content. He spoke to the live stream, not to me. He didn't ask if I was in pain. He didn't hold my hand. He angled the shot, adjusted the brightness, made sure his smile looked sincere. And the world applauded. Comments scrolled in, praising his devotion, sending hearts and prayers. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know he hadn't called in weeks, hadn't asked if I was eating, hadn't lifted a finger until it was profitable. I lay there, silent, humiliation heavier than the illness itself. I felt every eye on me, not with compassion, but with judgment. I was the pitiful father, lucky to have such a caring son. They didn't see the years of sacrifice. They didn't see the debts, the overtime, the marriage I lost. They saw only what Jason showed them. Tears threatened, but I swallowed them. Crying would make the shot more dramatic, and I refused to give him that gift. Instead, I turned my face slightly away, hiding what dignity I had left. My chest ached, not from failing lungs, but from the weight of betrayal. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. This was no longer about disappointment. This was no longer about patience. This was about survival of dignity, of truth, of the part of me Jason had not yet stolen. I knew then, this hospital was not just where I would fight for my life. It was where I would begin planning his downfall. After Jason's performance at my bedside, I realized silence was no longer protection, it was surrender. I needed armor, and I found it not in rage, but in records. One morning, the lawyer I had trusted years ago walked into my hospital room. Gray-haired, sharp-eyed, carrying a folder thick with documents. "Mr. Collins," he said softly, "you once asked me to draft a will with very specific terms. I think you'll want to revisit them now." I remembered. How could I forget? Years ago, when Jason first began showing cracks in his character, I had insisted on one clause, a safeguard against betrayal. If my son ever acted against my dignity or exploited me for personal gain, he would forfeit every inheritance. At the time, it felt like paranoia. Now, it felt like prophecy. The lawyer slid the papers across the tray table. My hands trembled as I read the words, but not from weakness, from clarity. Every clause was a blade, forged in ink, waiting for the right moment to cut. I asked him, "Does it still stand?" He adjusted his glasses, nodded once. "It stands. And with what happened here, with witnesses in this very ward, you have more than enough to enforce it." A weight lifted from my chest, heavier than any machine could measure. Jason thought he had the spotlight, but I held the script. Quiet, legal, binding. The lawyer advised me to gather testimony. Nurses, patients, anyone who saw the live stream, screenshots, recordings, every digital footprint Jason left would become evidence, proof that he turned my suffering into his spectacle. For the first time in years, I felt power return to my veins, not the power of youth or health, but the power of leverage. Numbers, clauses, witnesses, all the things Jason dismissed as relics of an old man's world. These would undo him. I closed the folder, set it by my bed, and exhaled slowly. Jason thought the hospital was his stage. He had no idea it was also my courtroom. The lawyer's visit stirred something sharp in me, something long buried under years of resignation. Once he left, I asked the nurse for my personal folder, the one where I kept bank statements, receipts, and notes scribbled through the years. I had saved them, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. I was a banker my whole life. Numbers were my language, order my comfort. Now they became my ammunition. Page after page told the story I had been too blind to read. Transfers to Jason's accounts labeled loan but never repaid. Withdrawals that aligned suspiciously with his vacations. Checks I had written when he called crying about emergencies that turned out to be upgrades on his lifestyle. The evidence wasn't hidden. It was brazen, written in ink, stamped by banks, approved by my own trembling signature. I traced the timeline. Tuition, car loans, wedding, credit card rescues, shop investments. Each one stacked on the other until the numbers blurred. I had poured more into Jason's life than into my own survival, and still, it was never enough for him. He had treated my sacrifice not as generosity, but as obligation. But the deeper cut came last. In recent months, I noticed small transfers I hadn't authorized, hundreds at first, then thousands. Jason had found ways to siphon from accounts I thought were secure. My passwords, my trust, my age, they all made me vulnerable. I had suspected carelessness on my part, but now I knew better. This wasn't carelessness. This was theft. My son, the boy I raised on packed lunches and bedtime stories, had been stealing from me while smiling into cameras, telling the world how much he loved his father. I felt the shame rise hot in my throat, but I forced it down. Shame was for victims. Evidence was for survivors. I organized the papers, marked the transfers, highlighted the thefts. Each sheet was a nail in the coffin of his false devotion. He thought followers and likes made him untouchable. But numbers never lie, and the numbers were mine. The next step was witnesses. Jason thought his live stream would vanish into the endless churn of online noise, but nothing digital truly disappears. I asked the nurses who had been present that day if they remembered. Their faces tightened, anger flashing in their eyes. "We remember," one said. "We saw everything." A patient from the bed across mine nodded. "He made you into a spectacle. We all felt it." His voice was hoarse but steady, carrying the weight of shared humiliation. In that moment, I realized I wasn't the only one Jason had disrespected. He had mocked the dignity of everyone in that ward by turning sickness into entertainment. The hospital administration had received complaints too. Visitors had reported the disruption, the shouting, the way Jason blocked hallways to capture the perfect shot. Each report was another piece of evidence, another stone in the wall I was building against him. But the most damning proof came from the live stream itself. A nurse had discreetly recorded part of it on her own phone, disgusted by the way Jason shoved a lens into my face. She sent it to me, her hands shaking with quiet fury. "Use this," she whispered. "No father deserves that." I watched the clip alone that night. There I was, weak, pale, fighting for air while Jason smiled wide for his invisible audience. He tilted the camera to show the tubes, my trembling hands, my closed eyes. He wasn't capturing love, he was harvesting pity. And behind him, I could hear the murmurs of the room, the gasps, the whispered judgment. For years I had carried my sacrifices in silence, hidden behind closed doors. Now Jason had given me a weapon of his own, making a recording of betrayal, undeniable, unspinnable. He wanted applause. He handed me evidence. I saved the file, backed it up in 3 places. My hands no longer shook from weakness. They shook from certainty. He thought the live stream was his triumph. It would become his undoing. When I was strong enough to sit up for longer hours, I asked my lawyer to review Jason's business filings. What we uncovered confirmed what I had always suspected. The shop was drowning. Debts stacked higher than profits, loans unpaid, suppliers threatening legal action. Without my constant injections of cash, Jason's so-called empire would collapse within months. The numbers told a story Jason would never admit. He had used my money not to build stability, but to build appearance. He bought flashy signs, expensive decor, advertising campaigns that looked grand online but produced little return. The shelves were full, but the ledger was empty. It wasn't a business, it was a masquerade. Worse still, Jason had leveraged my name on some of the accounts. Quietly, without asking, he had co-signed obligations with my credit. My signature, my reputation, bound to his failures. I felt the betrayal deepen not just as a father but as a banker. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had gambled with my integrity. The lawyer shook his head as he flipped through the documents. If you hadn't stepped in when you did, Mr. Collins, creditors would already be circling. I thought of Jason's followers, the glossy photos of him grinning in front of the shop, hashtags about hustle and grind. All a lie. A castle built of sand and borrowed time. Part of me pitied him because I knew what was coming, but pity is wasted on men who weaponize kindness. Jason didn't need sympathy. He needed exposure. I gathered the files, added them to the growing stack beside my hospital bed. Every debt, every false claim, every reckless purchase, it was all there. The mask he wore online would not survive the weight of these numbers. For decades, I had been the silent partner in his life, funding his illusions. Now, I would become his silent executioner. The shop he built with my blood would be the very stage where his downfall began. I decided to test him, one final time. I dialed Jason's number late one evening, my hand trembling less from weakness than from resolve. When he answered, his voice was hurried, distracted. I asked him for something simple just to bring me a meal the next day. Nothing fancy, just soup. There was a pause, then a sigh heavy with annoyance. Dad, I'm swamped. The shop is crazy right now. I can't drop everything for that. Can't you ask a nurse? A nurse? As if I were a stranger to him, as if I hadn't carried him through fevers, through school, through every crisis he ever faced. He didn't even try to hide his impatience. He was busy curating his image, too busy to be a son. I hung up quietly. That was all the confirmation I needed. Jason was incapable of care when no audience was watching. His love existed only in pixels and posts. Without a camera, he had nothing to offer. The next day, I scrolled through his profile. There he was, smiling wide, standing behind the shop counter, posting about family values and legacy. My stomach twisted at the hypocrisy. He had refused me soup but fed strangers lies. I bookmarked every post, every caption, every public declaration of devotion. Each one would serve as contrast against the truth I held in my hands, bank statements, witness accounts, recordings. The world would see the gap between his performance and his reality. That night, I didn't feel sadness. I didn't even feel anger. I felt something steadier, colder. Resolve. Jason had revealed himself fully, stripped of excuses. There was no boy left to protect. Only a man who had mistaken cruelty for strength. I looked at the growing stack of evidence beside my bed, legal papers, bank records, testimony, video. Each piece was a weapon, silent and undeniable. Jason thought I was too old, too weak, too invisible to fight back. He was wrong. I wasn't planning revenge anymore. I was preparing justice. My lawyer became my closest ally. While Jason posed for cameras, I signed papers. We met quietly in my hospital room. The tray table transformed into a desk of reckoning. Contracts, clauses, affidavits, they stacked higher each day. A fortress of ink and law between me and the boy who had become my adversary. We documented everything. Screenshots of his live stream, printed and notarized. Bank transfers, highlighted in yellow. Witness statements signed by nurses and patients. Even the hospital's incident reports, detailing the disruption he caused with his shouting and filming. Piece by piece, the narrative sharpened into something undeniable. Jason wasn't a dutiful son. He was a fraud. At night, I wrote my story by hand, page after page. Not for pity, not for sympathy, but for truth. I wrote about the tuition payments, the car loans, the wedding bills, the shop investments. I wrote about my wife leaving, about the loneliness, about the illness creeping in. I wrote about the live stream, the humiliation, the way his phone became more important than my breath. Every line was a record, every sentence a counterweight against his lies. I sealed the pages in envelopes, labeled them for the lawyer, and felt something shift inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just enduring, I was acting. Jason thought I was weak because I was quiet. But quiet is not weakness. Quiet is preparation. Quiet is a storm gathering its strength. One evening, the lawyer looked at me over the growing pile of evidence and said, "Mr. Collins, when this goes public, your son will lose everything." I nodded. Then he'll finally understand what loss feels like. The machines beside me beeped steadily, keeping time with my heartbeat. But the rhythm had changed. It was no longer the fading beat of a dying man. It was the steady drum of a march. I wasn't waiting for Jason to destroy me anymore. I was preparing to destroy the illusion of him. The more I uncovered, the calmer I became. Rage had burned itself out, leaving behind something sharper, cleaner. Discovery does that. It strips illusions until only facts remain. And the facts were clear. I had the weapon Jason could never fight. Not fists, not shouts, not curses. Law. The will was ironclad. The bank records were damning. The witnesses were credible. The video was undeniable. Even his shop's debts were a rope tightening around his neck. Jason had built his life like a house of cards, and with one breath of truth, I could bring it all down. I realized then that revenge wasn't the right word. Revenge suggested cruelty, malice, satisfaction in another's suffering. But I wasn't hungry for Jason's pain. I was hungry for balance, for justice, for the truth to weigh heavier than his lies. All those years I had thought of myself as weak, as a man too soft to say no. But weakness doesn't gather evidence. Weakness doesn't plan. Weakness doesn't prepare a future without its parasite. No, I wasn't weak. I was patient. And patience, when it ends, is a force. One night, I sat up in bed, papers spread across my lap, and whispered into the dark. "It's over, Jason. You just don't know it yet." The machines hummed, steady and obedient. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and victory. I felt no guilt, no hesitation, only clarity. Jason had mistaken my silence for surrender. But silence is only the pause before the verdict. And soon, very soon, the world would see him as I now did, not a son, not a savior, but an opportunist, stripped bare. I didn't need revenge. I needed the ledger to balance, and I had everything required to close it. When the reckoning came, I would not shout. I would not gloat. I would only watch, as the numbers settled into place, line by line, clause by clause. And when the total appeared, it would read, Jason Collins, nothing owed, nothing left. The first strike was silent. I signed the papers that activated my original will, the one drafted years ago with betrayal in mind. With a stroke of a pen, Jason's future inheritance dissolved into air. No house, no accounts, no assets. Everything I had built, everything I had once promised him, would bypass his greedy hands and be redirected elsewhere. Charities, community funds, places where sacrifice still meant something. My lawyer explained each clause as if reading scripture. This document supersedes any claim your son may attempt to make. As of today, he is legally disinherited. The words washed over me like clean water. For decades, Jason had treated my sacrifices as obligations, my love as his leverage. Now the ledger had flipped. He could live stream his devotion to the world, but the law, the cold, unblinking law, no longer recognized him as my heir. I imagined his face when he discovered it. The confusion, the outrage, the dawning horror. He would shout, he would argue, he would curse. But no performance, no phone, no followers could undo the ink already dry. The stage he built with lies would not save him from the signatures that sealed his fate. I lay back in the hospital bed, exhaling for what felt like the first time in years. The machines hummed in rhythm, almost celebratory. My body was frail, but my will was iron again. Jason had stolen my dignity in front of strangers. Now, I had taken back the only thing he truly valued, control of my estate. This was not the end. It was only the opening move, the first domino tipped. But it was enough to remind me that power does not always roar. Sometimes, it whispers through clauses, through signatures, through paper that cannot be erased. Jason thought my hospital bed was his stage. He didn't realize it was also his erasure. The next move struck closer to his pocket than his pride. I instructed my lawyer to freeze the accounts Jason had been quietly siphoning. The very wells he thought would never run dry turned to stone overnight. Transfers declined. Withdrawals denied. His cards failed at restaurants. His payments bounced at suppliers. The invisible hand he relied on had vanished. The bank called him in for explanations, but there were none to give. Jason stormed into the branch, demanding answers, red in the face, his voice echoing through the marble lobby. I wasn't there, but the manager, an old colleague of mine, called me later. His chuckle bitter. He looked like a man who thought the world owed him every dollar. I closed my eyes and pictured it, Jason slamming his card on the counter, insisting there must be a mistake, certain that his father's invisible safety net was still beneath him. But the truth had landed. There was no net, only the hard ground of his own making. For years, he had drained me without hesitation, treating my accounts as extensions of his own. Now the door was locked, and he didn't have the key. I held it, and I had thrown it away. News traveled quickly through his circle. Suppliers whispered. Friends distanced themselves. His wife's smile cracked when her credit line faltered. The man who had built an image of success on my sacrifices was suddenly scrambling to explain why his empire trembled. I felt no guilt. Why should I? The money was mine, earned through decades of sweat and silence. He had stolen enough. The freeze wasn't cruelty, it was justice. The kind of justice that doesn't shout but denies. The kind that humbles a man not with fists, but with absence. Jason had always mistaken my patience for permission. But permission, once revoked, is the harshest punishment of all. The third strike was public. I released the proof, the video clip of Jason's so-called devotion, the witnesses' statements, the bank records that told the truth he never would. My lawyer handled the channels, ensuring every piece was authenticated and beyond dispute. It wasn't gossip, it wasn't rumor. It was evidence, cold and sharp. The video spread fast, first among neighbors, then colleagues, then the wider community. People who once praised Jason for his devotion now watched with mouths open as his act unraveled. There he was, smiling into a lens, ignoring my pain, angling the camera to showcase my weakness. The same clip that had earned him praise now earned him disgust. Comments poured in, not of admiration but outrage. How could he? This is exploitation. That poor man. The applause turned to jeers, the hearts to daggers. Jason had built his brand on illusion, but truth always bleeds through the cracks. Friends stopped calling. Partnerships dissolved. Even his wife, once his eager accomplice in appearances, was spotted without her ring, her face drawn and cold. Image had been their currency, and now it was worthless. For decades I had been silent while Jason fed on my sacrifices. Now the world spoke for me. I didn't need to shout. I only needed to show. I lay in my hospital bed, watching the tide turn, and felt the scales finally begin to balance. Jason wanted to be seen. He wanted to be admired. He wanted the world to clap for his devotion. And in the end, he got exactly what he asked for. The world was watching. Only now, they were watching the truth. It didn't take long for the fallout to spread. Jason had always surrounded himself with people who fed on his image business partners, online friends, sponsors who wanted a piece of his shine. But shine fades quickly when the light turns sour. One by one, his allies slipped away. The supplier who once extended him credit stopped returning his calls. The landlord of his shop demanded payments in full. No more delays. Even the friends who crowded his table at clubs began to scatter, afraid of being tainted by his disgrace. Success, I realized, is a banquet only while the food lasts. When the table is bare, so are the chairs. His wife's silence grew louder than her words. I heard from neighbors that she stopped attending events with him, stopped posting their curated life online. The carefully polished image of the perfect couple cracked under the weight of unpaid bills and public shame. She had married a man who looked like a prince on stage, but off stage, he was just a beggar with borrowed crowns. Jason must have raged. He must have shouted, cursed, accused. But anger cannot rebuild bridges burned by truth. He had no one left to lean on, because every hand that once clapped for him had turned to point fingers instead. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching from my quiet hospital room, I felt no triumph, only confirmation. Jason had lived by performance. Now he was dying by exposure. The irony was almost poetic. He had stolen my dignity in public, and now, in public, he lost his own. All I did was remove the curtain. The rest was gravity, pulling him down. Jason's shop, once his pride, began to collapse. Without my quiet deposits propping it up, the walls trembled. Suppliers demanded payment, creditors pressed harder, and customers thinned as whispers of his disgrace spread. What had once looked like an empire was revealed as scaffolding held together with my money and his lies. I heard he spent nights pacing the shop floor, phone in hand, calling everyone he knew for help. No one answered. His posts online shifted from glossy displays of success to desperate pleas for support. The likes dwindled. The comments turned harsh. The audience he had courted now mocked him, calling him a fraud, a leech, a parasite. His wife stopped appearing in the shop altogether. She returned to her parents' home, leaving Jason alone among the shelves I had once paid to fill. I imagine him standing there, surrounded by unsold goods, listening to the echo of his own footsteps, where applause used to be. The collapse was not sudden, but steady, like a structure rotting from the inside. Each day brought a new demand he could not meet, a new crack in the foundation. The bank called in loans. The landlord posted notices. Jason tried to smile through it, to bluff, to insist he had it under control. But control is a luxury built on truth, and he had none. I didn't interfere. I didn't need to. Gravity did the work for me. A shop without integrity cannot stand. A man without character cannot endure. For years, Jason believed my sacrifices were infinite. Now he learned the truth. My resources had limits, and without them, his empire was nothing more than dust, pretending to be gold. I lay in my bed, breathing easier, knowing the collapse wasn't my loss. It was my liberation. The legal strike landed next. My lawyer arranged for notices to be published in the local paper and online bulletins, official statements announcing the activation of my will, the disinheritance clause, the freezing of accounts. There was no room for rumor, no space for denial. The words were there in black and white, stamped and signed, undeniable. The notice didn't just cut Jason off. It exposed him. People who once praised his devotion now learned the truth. He had been exploiting his own father, bleeding me dry, turning my illness into a sideshow for clicks. The public shame grew heavier than any debt collector's knock. Jason called me in a frenzy after the news broke. His voice was frantic, cracked with panic. "Dad, what are you doing? This isn't fair. You can't just—" I hung up before he finished. Fair. He dared to speak of fairness after decades of draining me. He wanted fairness now that the balance no longer tilted his way. My lawyer warned me that Jason might contest, might try to twist the story. But evidence is a wall no liar can climb. The bank statements, the witnesses, the video, each one a stone in that wall, higher and higher, until Jason was left screaming at the bricks. For the first time, I didn't feel cornered. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt free. His voice could no longer command me. His lies could no longer bind me. His future could no longer depend on me. The announcement spread quickly, shared across feeds, and whispered in cafes. "Did you hear?" The old man cut him off. Some pitied him. Most didn't. Because everyone knows a son who humiliates his father for applause deserves no inheritance but silence. And silence is exactly what I gave him. The confrontation was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was silent, deliberate, exactly as I intended. We met in my lawyer's office. Jason entered first, pacing, his eyes darting around as if searching for allies that no longer existed. When he saw me sitting calmly at the polished oak table, he tried a smile, the same practiced grin he once used for cameras. But there was no lens here. Only witnesses, only truth. He started with charm. "Dad, this is a misunderstanding. People are twisting things. You know I love you." His words fell flat, thinner than paper. I said nothing, only slid the folder of evidence across the table. Screenshots, bank statements, testimonies, the will. He rifled through them, face draining of color with each page. Finally, anger replaced charm. He slammed his fist on the table, voice cracking. "You can't do this to me! I'm your son!" I met his eyes, steady, unflinching. For the first time in decades, I felt no tremor, no fear. A son protects his father's dignity. You sold mine for likes. Silence filled the room, heavier than shouting ever could. My lawyer cleared his throat, reading the formal declaration of disinheritance. Jason's hands shook. His shoulders slumped. The performance had ended, and without an audience, he was just a man stripped bare. He begged then, quieter, almost childlike. "Please, Dad, don't do this. I'll change." But promises are meaningless when spoken at the edge of consequence. He had been given years to change. He chose not to. Now choice was gone. I leaned back, folded my hands, and let the silence close around us. For once, Jason had no script, no stage, no applause, only the truth staring him down. And truth is merciless. I waited until the lawyer finished reading the final clause. The room was heavy with Jason's ragged breathing, the sound of a man watching his empire dissolve. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I leaned forward, eyes steady on his, and spoke the words I had carried like a stone in my chest. "This isn't revenge, Jason. This is accountability." He flinched as if struck, maybe because deep down he knew it was true. Revenge is fueled by anger, but what I held was colder, cleaner. This wasn't rage, it was balance. The debts had come due, and for the first time, he was the one forced to pay. Jason tried to protest, but the lawyer cut him off with a firm recitation of the binding documents. His inheritance gone. His access to my accounts revoked. His reputation dismantled by evidence even he couldn't spin. Each word tightened the rope around him, not by cruelty, but by consequence. I watched the fight leave his shoulders, his chest deflating with the realization that there would be no applause, no redemption arc, only silence, only truth. For years, I had lived as a man stripped of dignity, sacrificing everything for a son who saw me as a stage prop. Now, with a single line, I reclaimed what was mine, not money, not power, but self-respect. Jason's eyes glistened, but I did not mistake them for remorse. They were not the tears of a son mourning his failures, they were the tears of a man mourning his losses. I rose slowly, my body frail but my spirit steady, and left the office without another word. Behind me, Jason sat in ruins of his own making. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen, and I would never look back. Jason tried to call me after the confrontation. Dozens of times. Each ring echoed in the quiet of my home, but I never answered. His voicemails grew frantic, pleading, bargaining, finally cursing. The cycle of manipulation in miniature. I listened once, then deleted them all. Words no longer had power, only deeds did, and his were already written in ink I could not erase. I knew what he wanted. Forgiveness. But forgiveness is not a currency I owe. He wanted me to reset the ledger, to pretend the debts of dignity and love had not piled high. But there is no reset. There is only reckoning. He showed up at my door one evening, pounding until the neighbors turned on their lights. I didn't open. I watched through the curtain as he slumped on the porch, shouting promises I had heard before. "I'll change, Dad. Just give me one more chance." His words broke into sobs, but even his tears felt practiced, like another performance without a camera. A man who learns to cry for applause never learns to cry for truth. When he realized I would not answer, he left. The night swallowed him, and I let it. For the first time in decades, my house felt like mine again. No echoes of demands, no weight of expectation. Just silence. Sweet, unbroken silence. It wasn't loneliness. It was peace. I sat at the table, a cup of tea warming my hands, and felt something I hadn't in years, ownership of my own life. Jason had taken my money, my marriage, my dignity, but he would not take my freedom. That was mine, and I had reclaimed it. I thought of the hospital, of the humiliation under the flickering lights, and I realized I had walked out of that place not only alive, but unchained. Jason may still rage, may still weep, may still beg, but he will do it alone, and I will not look back. News traveled quickly. Jason's downfall became dinner-table gossip, the kind neighbors whisper about with a mix of pity and satisfaction. "Did you hear?" His father cut him off. "Took everything." Some shook their heads. Most said, "About time." His reputation, once polished by lies and filters, lay in ruins. Sponsors withdrew. Friends unfollowed. The audience that once showered him with praise now mocked him in comment sections. Screenshots of his live stream spread again, not as proof of devotion, but as a warning of hypocrisy. He had built a tower out of my sacrifices, and now the world watched it crumble. Creditors circled, hungry and patient. They called his shop, sent letters, threatened court. Without my quiet hand covering the gaps, there was nothing left to shield him. The shelves emptied, the lights dimmed, and soon the doors closed. The dream he had once declared so proudly online became just another failed business. Another stain on his name. His wife left for good. I heard from a neighbor that she moved back in with her parents, leaving Jason with nothing but debts and a hollow reputation. For a man who lived for applause, silence became the cruelest punishment. No one was clapping anymore. No one was watching. And me? I watched from afar, calm, detached. Not with joy, not with sorrow, with finality. The world had done what I no longer needed to. Truth had taken its course. Jason was exposed, and the collapse was complete. I didn't smile at his suffering. I didn't cheer his losses. I simply breathed easier, knowing that balance had been restored. The debts were settled, not in dollars, but in dignity. For years, I had carried him, sacrificing my life to build his. Now, he carried the weight of his own choices, and it bowed him to the ground. That is not revenge. That is justice. In the aftermath, people often ask me if I felt lighter, if cutting Jason off had healed me. The truth is more complicated. Healing suggests repair, a return to what once was. But I no longer longed for what once was. That father-son bond was gone long before the live stream. What I felt now wasn't healing, it was clarity. I walked through my house without flinching at the sound of the phone. I opened my bank statements without bracing for the next demand. I brewed coffee in the morning and drank it slowly, without rushing to work extra shifts I no longer owed anyone. Small freedoms, invisible to others, monumental to me. What I regained wasn't wealth, it was dignity. For years, I thought dignity was a luxury reserved for men who hadn't been drained by family. But no, dignity is reclaimed when you refuse to be used any longer. It lives in silence, in boundaries, in the simple word no. Jason had mocked me for being small, for being cautious, for never taking risks. But dignity is not small. It is vast. It is the foundation beneath a man's life, and once cracked, it leaves him hollow. Jason may still chase lights and applause, but applause cannot fill the emptiness of a man without honor. Sometimes, at night, I think of the past, of his little hand in mine, of his laughter in the park, of his voice calling me Dad with unfiltered love, and grief comes, heavy and raw, but it passes, because I remind myself, that boy is gone. The man who remains is someone else entirely, someone I can neither save nor follow. So I let the memories live in the past, where they belong. I do not try to drag them forward. I do not try to remake Jason into what he should have been. I choose instead to remake myself. And in that choice, I find peace, not forgiveness, not reunion, but peace. My days are quieter now, and I've learned to savor the quiet. I walk to the park in the mornings, cane tapping on the path, and watch the sunlight spill through the trees. No phone buzzing in my pocket, no looming dread of Jason's demands. Just air in my lungs, slow and steady, reminding me that I am still here. I started rebuilding the pieces of myself I had long neglected. I rejoined a small reading club at the library, where men my age gather with paperbacks and stories. I even took up sketching again, clumsy lines, shaky hands, but each page filled with something that belongs only to me. For decades, my life was a ledger of sacrifices. Now, for the first time, I am writing entries for myself. People sometimes ask if I regret it cutting Jason off so completely. My answer is simple. Regret is for those who still hope. I have no hope for him, not because I am cruel, but because I finally accept what he chose to become. Acceptance is not bitterness. It is release. I spend afternoons tending to a small garden behind the house. The soil is stubborn, but it yields if you are patient. Patience I have in abundance. Watching seedlings push through the dirt feels like watching myself in miniature proof that life can sprout again, even after long seasons of neglect. Jason has vanished from my days. No more calls, no more visits. His absence isn't emptiness, it is space. Space for breath, for growth, for the fragments of joy I thought I had lost forever. I don't fill that space with anger or mourning. I let it be. For once, my life belongs to me, and that is enough. In time, the whispers around town shifted. At first, people pitied Jason, shaking their heads at his fall. But as more of the truth settled in the live stream, the bank records, the witnesses, they began to look at me differently. Not as a frail old man abandoned by his family, but as someone who finally stood his ground. Neighbors who once praised Jason for being a good son now stopped by with quiet respect. Some apologized for believing the act. Others simply offered to mow the lawn, bring groceries, or sit for tea. Their kindness was a different kind of medicine, one that didn't come in pills, but in recognition. I wasn't invisible anymore. At the library, a fellow retiree clapped my shoulder and said, "Took guts to do what you did. Most of us would have just kept giving." His words carried no pity, only admiration. It startled me, then warmed me. For so long, I had been ashamed of my silence, my surrender. Now, people saw strength in my refusal. I realized something then. Reputation is not about how loudly you speak, but how firmly you stand when it matters. Jason had lived loud, shouting his love into cameras. I had lived quiet, bleeding in silence. But in the end, truth gave me back my name. I don't bask in the attention. I don't crave it. But I accept it because it reminds me I am more than the sum of Jason's betrayals. I am a man who endured, who drew a line, who reclaimed what was his. The town no longer calls me unlucky. They call me resilient. And that word feels heavier, truer, than any applause Jason ever earned. I hear of Jason now only in fragments. A neighbor saw him once, alone at a diner, staring into a coffee he couldn't afford to refill. Another said they spotted him selling off equipment from the failed shop, haggling for scraps of money. He drifts from place to place, untethered, carrying the weight of debts and disgrace. The empire he built on my shoulders has collapsed into rubble at his feet. His friends are gone. His wife is gone. Even his followers have moved on, chasing the next spectacle. Fame is fickle, and when the curtain drops, the audience scatters. Jason is left clapping for himself in an empty room. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks of me, if he curses me, blames me, paints me as the villain who destroyed his life. Perhaps he does, but blame cannot rebuild bridges burned by truth. He may rage, he may sulk, he may spiral, but he does it without me. For years, I carried him. I let his weight bend my back, drain my pockets, hollow my life. Now he carries himself, and the burden is heavier than he ever imagined. That is not my cruelty, that is his consequence. I don't watch closely. I don't follow his downfall like a spectator at a show. I turn away, because his story is no longer mine to narrate. He chose his path. I chose mine, and mine leads forward, not back. Jason is not my shadow anymore. He is just another man in the crowd, swallowed by his own mistakes. And I walk lighter without him. The day I walked out of the lawyer's office for the last time, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The sky seemed wider, the air sharper, as if the world itself had been waiting for me to reclaim my freedom. I didn't look back, not at the building, not at the years I had lost, and certainly not at Jason. I went home to a house that was finally mine. I brewed tea, opened the window, and let the wind fill the rooms where silence once felt suffocating. Now, that silence was not emptiness, it was peace. A peace I had bought not with money, but with boundaries. Jason's face no longer haunted my thoughts. When it did appear, it wasn't as my son, but as a man I had cut loose. I didn't hate him. I didn't forgive him. I simply released him. Hatred ties you to the one who wronged you. Forgiveness demands reconciliation, but release is freedom. People talk about closure as if it's a door you slam shut, but for me, it was a door I walked through, leaving it open behind me, knowing I'd never step back inside. Jason could linger in the dark if he wished. I had chosen the light. I whispered once more, not for him but for myself. It's done. And with that, the story ended. Not with revenge, not with reconciliation, but with freedom, the kind that comes when you finally stop carrying what was never yours to bear. I live now without expectation, without fear, without the shadow of a son who turned my life into his stage. The curtain has fallen, the theater is empty, and I am no longer part of the play. This is not revenge, this is release, and I will never look back.